In the 1980s, Adak Island, Alaska, had a McDonald's. It had a bowling alley. It had a school with more than 500 students and 37 teachers. It had 6,000 people living on it, in the middle of the Bering Sea, closer to Russia than to most of the continental United States. The Navy built all of it, because the Navy needed a base there, and then in less than a decade, the Navy decided it didn't need the base anymore, and walked away from all of it, the McDonald's, the school, the bowling alley, 6,000 people's worth of houses, and left it standing exactly as it was. That is the pattern behind every town on this list. The United States military has built entire communities from nothing, over and over, for 100 years, not just bases, but full towns, with schools and churches and grocery stores and swimming pools, built to house the people needed to run a mission that the government considered essential. And then, when the mission ended, the military simply left, not gradually, not with much warning. The furniture is still in some of these buildings. This video counts down 10 places the US military built and then walked away from. All documented, all real, all still standing in some form today. Stay with me to the end, because the final town on this list once had a McDonald's whose 1994 menu board is still readable today, advertising a Big Mac meal for $4.59 in a dining room that nobody has eaten in for 30 years. Let's begin. In 1955, the Army built a Nike missile site in Marin County, California, just north of San Francisco, as part of a nationwide network designed to shoot down Soviet bombers before they could reach American cities. The site, now known as SF-88, was one of hundreds of similar installations that ringed every major American city during the 1950s and 1960s, hidden in plain sight in suburban hillsides and coastal bluffs, manned around the clock by soldiers who lived in barracks a short walk from missiles armed and ready to fire. The Nike program was designed around a very specific threat: Soviet long-range bombers. When intercontinental ballistic missiles made that threat largely obsolete in the 1960s and 1970s, the entire nationwide network of missile sites became unnecessary almost overnight. Site by site, across the country, the Army shut the bases down. Most were stripped, demolished, or sold off for scrap. A handful were preserved. SF-88 is one of the best preserved Nike sites in the country today. Maintained as a museum where visitors can walk through the same underground missile magazines that once held live nuclear-capable weapons, see the barracks where soldiers lived, and stand in the launch control room where an order to fire would have been received. It is one of the only places in America where you can see, intact, exactly what a piece of Cold War infrastructure looked like from the inside. Because almost everywhere else, that infrastructure was torn down the moment it stopped being useful. Around New York City, in a ring extending through New Jersey, the Army built more than a dozen Nike missile bases during the 1950s to defend the country's largest metropolitan area from Soviet air attack. Each base needed soldiers, and the soldiers needed somewhere to live, not just barracks, but in many cases full housing developments for married personnel and their families, built specifically to support a mission that both the government and the residents understood might last for decades. It didn't. As the missile program was phased out through the 1960s and 1970s, base after base was decommissioned. The housing that had been built for military families was, in many cases, simply abandoned rather than repurposed, left standing empty in towns like East Hanover, New Jersey, where entire streets of former military housing sat with broken windows and doors hanging off their hinges for years after the last residents moved out. What makes these sites unusual is how ordinary they look. They are not remote desert installations or hidden mountain bunkers. They are suburban New Jersey streets, the kind you'd drive past without a second look, except that every house on them has been empty for half a century, and the neighborhood was built by the Army specifically to defend New York City from a war that never came. At the easternmost tip of Long Island, in Montauk, New York, the Air Force built Camp Hero in the early years of the Cold War, disguising it, according to a persistent piece of Cold War-era misdirection, as a fake fishing village, complete with buildings painted to look like ordinary houses and a water tower shaped like a lighthouse, in an attempt to conceal a functioning military radar installation from Soviet reconnaissance. The base's official purpose was straightforward. It hosted a long-range radar system as part of the Continental Early Warning Network designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers or missiles. What made Camp Hero different from most Nike and radar sites was the degree to which its actual, publicly acknowledged mission got overtaken in popular imagination by rumor and speculation, much of it centered on supposed secret experiments that the government has never substantiated and that most serious historians treat as unfounded. The base was deactivated in 1980 and transferred to New York State, which turned most of the site into Camp Hero State Park. Today, visitors can walk through the park and see the massive AN/FPS-35 radar tower still standing, rusted and inoperative, along with several other Cold War structures left in place when the Air Force departed. It has become one of the more visited abandoned military sites in the country, not necessarily because of what actually happened there, but because of what people have imagined happened there. A reminder that when the government builds something in secret and then leaves it standing, empty, the stories people tell about it can outlast the facts by a wide margin. In the salt flats of western Utah, less than a mile from the Nevada border, the Army Air Forces built Wendover Air Base in 1940, eventually expanding it to become one of the largest military installations in the country, covering more than 3.5 million acres of bombing and gunnery ranges. At its peak during the Second World War, more than 20,000 people lived and worked at Wendover, a full military city built from scratch in one of the most remote, inhospitable landscapes in the continental United States. Wendover's most consequential role came in 1944, when it was selected as the training site for the 509th Composite Group, the unit that would carry out the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The crews that flew those missions, including the crew of the Enola Gay, trained here, on the same runways and in the same hangars that still stand on the site today, practicing bomb drops in near total secrecy in a landscape so remote and empty that almost nothing could be observed from outside the base's perimeter. When the war ended, Wendover's population collapsed almost as quickly as it had grown. The base was progressively deactivated and transferred out of military hands over the following decades, and much of the original 1940s infrastructure, hangars, barracks, and the building where the atomic bomb components were assembled before loading, still stands today, in various states of preservation and decay, a full Cold War-era airbase sitting largely empty on the edge of the Great Salt Lake Desert, most of its original purpose long since finished. Before we go further, something about how these places actually get abandoned. It is rarely a single decision. It is usually a long, bureaucratic process that starts with a base realignment and closure recommendation, moves through congressional review, and ends, sometimes years later, with an actual closure date. But for the people who lived on these bases, the experience was often much more sudden: a posting to a new assignment, orders to relocate, a deadline to be out of base housing by a certain date. The town would still be standing when they left, it just wouldn't have anyone living in it anymore. Chanute Air Force Base, in Rantoul, Illinois, is a case study in what that leaves behind. At its peak during the Second World War, Chanute housed 25,000 military personnel, more people than lived in the town of Rantoul itself, making the base functionally larger than the community that hosted it. Chanute included a 500,000 square foot classroom building called White Hall, at the time the largest pre-Pentagon military building constructed anywhere in the United States, built to train the mechanics and technicians the Air Force needed by the tens of thousands. When the base was closed in 1993, as part of a nationwide round of post-Cold War base closures, the massive infrastructure built to support tens of thousands of people simply stopped being used, all at once, leaving a small Illinois town suddenly responsible for what to do with a military city several times its own size. Fort Ord, on the Monterey Bay coastline in California, trained millions of American soldiers across nearly 8 decades of continuous operation, from the First World War through Vietnam, on land that eventually grew to more than 28,000 acres, making it one of the largest Army installations ever built in the continental United States. At its peak, Fort Ord functioned as a complete small city: barracks, family housing, schools, chapels, a hospital, and recreational facilities serving tens of thousands of soldiers and their dependents at any given time. The base was selected for closure in 1991 and formally shut down in 1994. And unlike many BRAC closures that transferred cleanly to civilian development, Fort Ord's transition was complicated by an enormous and expensive problem. Decades of live-fire training exercises had left the soil riddled with unexploded ordnance across large sections of the property, some of it in areas that were never designated as active training ranges. Cleanup has continued for more than 3 decades since the base closed, and portions of the former installation remain fenced off and restricted from public access to this day, even as other sections have been redeveloped into a university campus, housing, and parkland. Fort Ord today is a place of striking contrasts. Thriving university buildings and public trails, a short distance from sections still marked with unexploded ordnance warnings, all of it built on land that the Army occupied, developed and populated for the better part of a century before deciding it no longer needed any of it. On the western shore of Massacre Bay on Adak Island, the westernmost point of the Aleutian chain and one of the most remote pieces of United States territory anywhere in the world, the military built a settlement during the Second World War called, simply, Navy Town. Adak was the site of the only land battle fought on incorporated United States soil during the entire war, when American forces retook the island from a Japanese garrison in 1943 in brutal, close quarters, fighting across some of the harshest terrain and weather conditions any American soldiers faced anywhere in the conflict. After the battle, the military maintained a presence on Adak for decades, primarily through a Coast Guard Loren navigation station that continued operating on the island long after the war itself had ended, supported by the infrastructure of Navy Town, which continued to exist as a small, functioning military settlement in one of the most isolated locations the United States government has ever maintained a permanent population. The Coast Guard station at Adak, known as Adak Station, was finally decommissioned in 2010, at which point the island's population dropped to 0 for the first time since before the Second World War. Navy Town, and Adak Island as a whole, is now entirely uninhabited. No permanent residents, no ongoing military presence, nothing but the remains of a settlement that the United States built at the absolute edge of its own territory, fought one of its hardest battles to reclaim, and eventually decided it no longer needed to maintain. In the mountains north of Los Angeles, Nike missile site LA-88 operated from 1957 to 1974, one of dozens of Nike installations that ringed the Los Angeles basin during the height of the Cold War, largely unknown to the millions of residents living in the neighborhoods the sites were built to protect. LA-88 had an unusual security arrangement even by Nike standards. Rather than a large human guard force, the site's perimeter was patrolled primarily by sentry dogs and their handlers, a comparatively minimal security detail for a site that, at various points, held live nuclear-capable missiles. When the Nike program wound down in the 1970s, LA-88 was decommissioned along with the rest of the network, and unlike many Nike sites that were demolished or redeveloped, LA-88 was largely left in place. A full demolition was proposed in the early 2000s but ultimately judged too expensive to carry out, leaving the site in a kind of administrative limbo, not maintained, not actively used, and not torn down. What remains today is a semi-abandoned Cold War missile site sitting quietly in the hills above one of the largest cities in the country, visited occasionally by hikers and explorers who stumble onto rusted structures and collapsing buildings without necessarily realizing what they represent. The physical remains of a defense system built to protect a city that, for decades, mostly never knew it was there. In the flat farmland of north-central North Dakota, the Army built one of the strangest and most expensive military installations in American history, the Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex, a missile defense system centered on a massive, windowless pyramid-shaped radar building that locals still refer to informally as the Pyramid of North Dakota. The complex was designed to use long-range radar and underground-launched interceptor missiles to shoot down incoming Soviet nuclear warheads, and it represented one of the most technically ambitious defense projects the United States had ever attempted. The system was declared fully operational in October 1975, after roughly $6 billion in construction costs. Congress voted to shut it down less than 4 months later, having concluded that the system was strategically unnecessary and prohibitively expensive to maintain relative to the protection it actually provided. It is one of the shortest operational lifespans of any major American defense system ever built, A complex that took years to construct and cost billions of dollars operated, in any meaningful sense, for less than a single winter. Most of the underground missile infrastructure was decommissioned shortly after. Though portions of the site remain under federal control today, the Pyramid Radar Building still stands, visible for miles across the flat North Dakota prairie, an enormous, silent monument to a defense system that was finished, activated, and abandoned all within the span of about 4 months. In the Aleutian Islands, roughly 1,200 miles from Anchorage, Adak Island became one of the most remote inhabited places the United States government has ever built. The Army established a base there during the Second World War as a staging ground for operations against Japanese forces occupying nearby islands, and through the Cold War, the Navy expanded it into a major submarine surveillance and anti-submarine warfare facility, eventually growing the base into a genuine small city. At its peak in the 1980s, Adak was home to more than 6,000 sailors, officers, and their families, making it, for a time, Alaska's 8th largest city, despite sitting on a remote volcanic island in the middle of the Bering Sea. The base had everything a city that size would need: a school with hundreds of students, a bowling alley, a movie theater, and, opening in 1986, a McDonald's, reportedly the westernmost McDonald's in the United States, serving sailors and military families thousands of miles from the nearest major mainland city. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Adak's strategic importance collapsed almost as quickly as its population had grown to fill it. The Navy shuttered the base in 1993 and completed the closure by 1997. The McDonald's had already closed in 1994, its interior left largely undisturbed, chairs stacked on tables, the drive-through menu board still mounted and still readable, advertising a Big Mac meal for $4.59, prices that have not changed because no one has ever reopened the register to change them. The school closed the same year. The population, once over 6,000, dropped to a few dozen. Photographs of the abandoned McDonald's have circulated online for years, drawing comments from people who grew up on Adak as children of military families, recognizing the exact tables where they once ate as kids, in a restaurant that has been sitting empty, frozen at 1994 prices, for 3 decades. In recent years, as the U.S. military has renewed interest in Arctic strategy, there has been discussion of reopening Adak as a military installation once again, which would mean, potentially, rebuilding a town that the government built once, abandoned completely, and may now decide it needs back. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let us know in the comments which of these 10 places surprised you the most, and subscribe for more deep dives into America's hidden and forgotten history.